Hi friends, welcome back to Quiet Time. Before we start reading the book, I just want to apologize if you can hear a lot of background noise right now. I'm not sure if you can. It's pretty warm in my office right now, so I have my fan going, and I also have the windows open in the house, and there's quite a few of my neighbors doing some yard work. So you might hear a weed whacker or a lawnmower now and then, but just try to relax, take some deep breaths, get your body ready to rest. And try to listen through the noise to our chapter today. We're on chapter 11. There's only 14 chapters in this book. I thought there was 15. We're on page 121. The difficulty with Dr. Drew. Dr. Drew. Do you guys think that the veterinarian is Dr. Drew? Maybe. Do you guys think that Humphrey's actually even sick? No, I don't think he is either, but we could be wrong. Let's take a look. It turns out I was confused. A vegetarian eats only vegetables. A veterinarian is an animal doctor. That's why he started talking about food when Mr. Brisbane brought up the veterinarian. Not a doctor who is an animal, but a human doctor who takes care of animals, like dogs, cats, horses, and hamsters, sick hamsters. Mr. Brisbane was right. I hadn't been eating much lately, but it wasn't because I was sick. It was because I felt so guilty about Miranda. Could a veterinarian, Mr. Brisbane called it a vet, figure that out? I don't think so. It was quiet in the Brisbane house for most of the day. Mr. Brisbane spent a lot of time in his workshop making things out of wood, like birdhouses and picture frames. Og was unusually quiet, even for him. There were no giggling students, or recess bells, or spelling tests to keep me awake. I finally crawled into my sleeping hut, but I didn't actually fall asleep. I kept picturing my friends hard at work on Humphreyville. Or, since I was in so much trouble, maybe they'd change the name. Somehow, Ogburg didn't sound very good to me. The time dragged on until Mrs. Brisbane finally came home. "How are the guys?" she asked her husband. Fine, although Humphrey is quieter than usual." "Did you get my message about the vet?" "Yes, I telephoned Mrs. Payne to tell her we're getting Humphrey examined this afternoon. In fact, I invited her to come along." Gulp. I was going to the vet's office that same afternoon with Mrs. Payne? What did she say? "She goes to work at 4 o'clock, Mrs. Brisbane checked her watch, which reminds me, we better get going if we're going to make it there by 4:30. 4:30? It was close to 4:30 already. I only had time to squeak "wish me luck" to Og before my cage was covered and whisked out the door to the Brisbanes. As long as I'd been in room 26, I'd worried about the problems of my classmates. Now I was in big trouble myself, and my friends didn't even know about it. I was glad my cage was covered because the air was freezing cold, but traveling that way was like being blindfolded. By the time I could see what was going on around me, I was in the waiting room of the veterinarian's office. "Dr. Drew will see Humphrey in a few minutes," a man behind the desk told us. I had a few minutes to look around, and I was shocked. To the right of me was a large white dog with brown freckles and huge teeth, like Miranda's unfriendly dog Clem. He licked his chops. That meant he was hungry. I quickly turned my head to the left of me, and there was a cage with a cat in it. The cat had black fur and white paws. Its dark green eyes were staring at me, a little too hard for my own comfort. I decided to look straight ahead, where there was a huge tank with fish of every color. Some had stripes, and even polka dots. They swam around and around in a pink castle. I wished I could be behind the glass instead of sitting so close to these two dangerous creatures. Those few minutes the man at the desk had mentioned seemed like hours to me. Then something shocking happened. The door swung open, and in walked Mr. Payne, followed by Mandy, Pammy, Tammy, and Brian. Mrs. Brisbane was as stunned as I was. "Mandy, what are you doing here?" Mandy looked as if she wanted to be anywhere but in that office. Mrs. Brisbane gained control of herself and put her hand out to Mr. Payne. "Hello, Mr. Payne. This is a surprise." She introduced the Paynes to Mr. Brisbane, and everyone said hello. I must say, Mr. Payne didn't seem very happy to be there. Mandy acted even unhappier. I didn't know if it was because of me or because of her red nose. Pammy and Tammy were too busy kicking each other to notice where they were, while Brian tore pages out of magazines. The wife said I should come and see what the doctor says. Mr. Payne was extremely glum. "If that's okay with you." Mrs. Brisbane politely said it was fine with her, but it didn't seem fine to me. Mandy's mom didn't trust Mrs. Brisbane to tell her honestly what the doctor said. That ruffled my fur a bit. Now see here, Mr. Payne," I squeaked, which wasn't a good idea. When they heard me, the dog and the cat got excited, barking and snarling and growling and meowing in a very unnecessary way. I only hoped that they wouldn't discover that my cage had a lock that didn't lock. Just as I was about to escape into my sleeping hut for safety, a woman dressed in all pale green entered. She had dark skin, dark hair, and big dark eyes like Miss Mack, my first teacher. "Hi, I'm Dr. Melissa Drew. Is Humphrey all set?" I was all set to get out of that waiting room, I can tell you that. Mrs. Brisbane stepped forward and introduced everyone to the vet. It was decided that Mandy and her sisters and brother would stay in the waiting room while the adults came into the examination room with me. It was nice and warm inside, so why was I quivering and shivering? Dr. Drew put my cage on a padded table and smiled at me. "Now, Humphrey, is this your first exam?" Yes, I squeaked loudly, which made Dr. Drew smile even more. "He certainly sounds healthy," she said as she opened my cage, reached in, and took me out. "Don't worry, Humphrey, this won't hurt a bit." Dr. Drew spoke to the humans. "This isn't any different than the kind of examinations you get. Now, has Humphrey had any problems lately?" "He's pretty peppy, but he hasn't been eating as much as usual," said Mr. Brisbane. "Made all my kids sick," said Mr. Payne. Dr. Drew was surprised. "Really?" "Yep, he spent the weekend at our house, and all my kids got sick. Some of the other kids at school too, right?" He turned to Mrs. Brisbane. "Everyone who's been sick seems to have a cold, even children who didn't take Humphrey home," Mrs. Brisbane said firmly. "It's highly unusual for humans to get sick from handling hamsters. It's more common for a hamster to pick up a disease from a human or another animal, but let's check him out." Dr. Drew's touch was so gentle, I relaxed. She put one hand underneath me and one hand above my head, making a little tent for me. Very, very, very nice. "We'll check the eyes first, because that's where we usually see signs of infection or disease in hamsters." Cupping me in one hand, she shined a tiny light directly in one eye. "Whoa, that's a wake-up call." Next, she checked my other eye. "Looking good," she said. "No discharge or inflammation. Now I'll listen to his heartbeat." Dr. Drew picked up a stethoscope, a word I do not want to see on a spelling test. It's got a lot of letters in it. It had a plug for each of her ears and a teeny piece that she held against my chest. First, she listened. Then she smiled. "Excellent. A very healthy heart, Humphrey. Now let's check out that weight." She set me on a scale that was flat and square. She also put a few chunks of Nutri-Nibbles on the scale. Those will keep him there for a second. She let go of me while I picked up a treat and said, "Well, even if he's not been eating well, his weight is completely normal." When I nibbled away, Dr. Drew and Mrs. Brisbane discussed what I ate. "He usually eats everything: vegetables, fruit, hamster food, yogurt drops," Mrs. Brisbane said. "Excellent," said the vet. "Lots of variety. That's what hamsters like, right, Humphrey?" "You bet," I squeaked, and the doctor chuckled. "But I just found some old food hidden in his cage and realized he's not been eating as much as before," Mr. Brisbane said. Dr. Drew bit her lip for a second and asked, "Has there been any changes in his environment lately?" Mrs. Brisbane nodded. "Well, I had to take him out of the classroom because of the complaint." I noticed Mr. Payne was staring at his shoes. "So I guess things are a little upset for him," my teacher added. "That could be it," said Dr. Drew. "Some hamsters are very sensitive, even to small changes." She was right about that. I am a very sensitive hamster, and Dr. Drew was a very good veterinarian. Sometimes hamsters get infections in their cheek pouches because they store food there. So, open wide, Humphrey. She picked me up gently and pulled my mouth open, using a small light to look inside. Clean as a whistle, she said. Fur is nice and shiny. I'll take a sample of some stool if there's any in there. I was confused, but turns out that stool is poo. She took some from my cage with tweezers and put it in a tube. It's nice and firm, which is a good sign. What a surprise. Usually when my classmates clean up my cage, they go, ew, or yuck, when they get to that poo part. But it didn't bother the doctor at all. She even had a nice name for it, stool. The vet held me up to her eye level and said, Humphrey, we need to get you back in your old environment, but in the meantime, you are one healthy, handsome hamster. I remember when Miss Mack picked me up at Panorama and told Carl, the store clerk, he's obviously the most intelligent and handsome hamster you have. I sure miss Miss Mack. But she sent me postcards, so I knew she still cared. Dr. Drew cared too. She might not have been able to figure out that I felt guilty about Miranda, but she had figured out that I wasn't sick. Try varying his food even more, and just try to make sure he perks up. I'm giving you some yummy vitamin chews. I guarantee that Humphrey will like them. I liked them already. In fact, I felt so happy I was a little hungry. She gently put me back in my cage. Humphrey, I have a new friend here today that you might like to meet. She went to the doctor and called out, Judy, could you bring Winky in here? Then she turned to Mr. Payne. Tell me, what did the doctor say about your children's illnesses? Mr. Payne looked down at the tips of his toes and squirmed like sit-still Steph. Didn't take 'em. Kind of expensive. See, we haven't got insurance and... I see, said the vet. But they're better now? Yes, they had runny noses and coughs and a temperature for a few days. Just about drove me nuts. I take care of them now that He stopped. Mr. Payne sure had a hard time finishing his sentences. Well, I don't think it was from Humphrey, said the vet. The wife's concerned it is. There was silence until Mrs. Brisbane said, Dr. Drew, could you write a report or a letter and send it to Mrs. Payne? That would probably put her mind at ease. In fact, I could pass it on to the principal and the other parents. Dr. Drew smiled. Sure, I'd be glad to. Just then, the door opened and a blonde woman who wore a pink smock with pictures of teddy bears all over came in, carrying a small cage. Here is Winky, she said. Dr. Drew introduced everyone to Judy and said, Judy rescues hamsters. Sometimes she has more than 20 in her house. Could you imagine having 20 hamsters at your house? Holy moly. Rescues them from where? Asked Mrs. Brisbane. It was the exact question I wanted to ask. I was picturing hamsters on top of burning buildings, floating down rafts in a flood, trapped by the weight of an avalanche. Sometimes people decide that taking care of hamsters is too much work. That's something to think about when you get a pet, said Judy. Mostly, I get them from Petorama. They're rejects, like Winky here. Reject hamsters? Asked Mr. Brisbane. Yes, if they're not perfect, people won't buy them. She put Winky's cage on the table next to mine. I could easily see how he got his name, because he was winking at me. I winked back. For some reason, Winky was only born with one eye, and he doesn't have any teeth. Neither of those things bother him. He's able to eat a variety of food, and he only needs one good eye. He does look like he's winking, said Mrs. Brisbane. He's very cute. He was not as handsome as I am, but I have to admit, he looked like a nice fella. Hi, Winky, you look fine to me, I squeaked, and I was surprised when he squeaked back. Thanks, fella. I was kind of worried when Petorama rejected me. Luckily, Judy came around and rescued me. He understood me, and I understood him. This was a first. Petorama, that's where I came from, I told him. Remember Carl? He just got made assistant manager, Winky squeaked at me. Imagine that. They had a pretty big party to celebrate, he added. You don't say. Hey, did they ever sell that chinchilla, I asked. Yep, real nice family took 'em, he told me. Oh, just before I left, and they got a big shipment of new hamster cages. One of them is 4 levels high. No kidding. Suddenly, all the humans, even Mr. Payne, were laughing. Sounds like these two have a lot in common, said Mrs. Brisbane. Let's get them a little closer. Dr. Drew took me out of the cage. Judy took Winky out of his cage. Now, you shouldn't put hamsters together in the same cage unless they've been raised together, but they can sniff each other. Judy held Winky up close to me, and we stared at each other eye to eye. I took a big sniff. Yep, he was a hamster, all right. Where do you live now? He asked. I live in a schoolroom with lots of kids, I said. Sounds like fun, Winky replied. It is, but it's work too. Winky definitely winked at me. Nice work if you can get it, pal. With that, we were whisked back into our cages. If you know anyone who wants a special winking happy hamster, give me a call, said Judy. I only had time to squeak good luck before Winky was gone. Any other questions? Asked the vet. No one had any, so my cage was closed up and we were ready to go. Before we got to the door, Dr. Drew said, "Oh, by the way, if you know anyone searching for a job, we've got an opening for a veterinary assistant." Mr. Payne stopped in his tracks. What's that? Oh, because Mr. Payne needs a job, remember? Someone to feed animals, give them water, take them for walks, clean cages, give them medicine. This person has to be able to lift heavy bags of dog food, interact with animals, that sort of thing. We'll train. That means that they'll teach them how to do the job. Mr. Payne had a strange look in his eyes. And the hours? There's some flexibility there. Do you have someone in mind? Mr. Payne hesitated, and I decided to squeak up for him. He needs a job. Hire Mr. Payne. Please, please, please. Dr. Drew turned toward me. Humphrey, do you have someone in mind? Mr. Payne! I never squeaked so loud in my whole life. I know you're trying to tell us something. Mr. Payne cleared his throat. I might be interested. I don't know if I'm right for the job. The vet turned to him and smiled. How do you feel about taking care of animals? Good, Mr. Payne said. I had a nice dog when I was a kid. Name was Lady, and I learned a lot from watching this exam. I'm strong. I'm a good worker. Why don't you fill out an application now and come in and talk to my partners and me tomorrow morning? You can bring the children if you need to. I saw something new in Mr. Payne's eyes. They came to life for a few seconds. Okay, he said. Soon we were out in the waiting room. This is the last page of chapter 11, friends. Soon we were out in the living room. Mandy was holding a funny dog in her lap. He had short legs and a long body. Tammy, Pammy, and Brian stood around her staring at the odd animal. See, Dad? It's a wiener dog, she cried out. The lady sitting next to Mandy, who obviously owned the dog, smiled. A dachshund, actually. His name is Fritz. Fritz did look like a wiener or a sausage or a hot dog. Do you like dogs, Mandy? Asked Mrs. Brisbane. Yes, and cats too, but what I'd really like is a hamster. Smart girl, that Mandy. Dr. Drew took Fritz and his owner into the office. Kids, I've got to fill out some papers, said Mr. Payne. Please be quiet and let me concentrate. Okay, we'll watch the fish, said Mandy. How's Humphrey? Humphrey, said Mrs. Brisbane. Humphrey's just perfect. It was nice to hear that I was perfect, even though I knew I was not. The title at the end of this chapter is Humphrey Examined by Veterinarian. Students anxiously await Classroom Hamster's Medical Report, the Humphreyville Herald. All right, friends, we'll pick up on chapter 12 on page 134 tomorrow. Have a great rest.